The council chamber was massive, bigger than any building Daniel Wright had ever seen on Earth. The ceiling stretched so high above that clouds actually formed near the top. 17 different alien species sat in their designated sections, each area modified to suit their specific needs. Some breathed methane, others needed water tanks, and a few existed as pure energy contained in special fields. Daniel stood at the human podium, feeling very small and very aware that he was representing all of humanity. His uniform was crisp and clean, pressed that morning with extra care. Next to him stood Karen Phillips, his cultural attaché, a woman who had spent 15 years studying ancient human history and mythology. They had prepared for months for this meeting, ready to answer questions about human culture, technology, and intentions. The Galactic Assembly had existed for over 50,000 years. Humans were newcomers, barely out of their own solar system, asking to join something ancient and complex. Every species here had been through this process, standing where Daniel stood now, answering questions and proving their worth. The Crithian ambassador rose from its seat. The being was beautiful in an alien way, made entirely of living crystal that caught and refracted light into rainbow patterns. It was old, ancient even by galactic standards, and its species had founded the council itself. When it spoke, its voice sounded like wind chimes and distant bells translated into English by the devices in Daniel's ear. "Captain Wright, we have reviewed your cultural documents with great interest. Your species has a fascinating history, full of conflict and growth, violence and beauty. We have studied your religions, your mythologies, your stories of gods and heroes." Daniel nodded respectfully, waiting. He knew questions were coming. The Crithians always had questions. "We have noticed something unusual," the ambassador continued. "Nearly every species in this chamber has a god of war in their mythology. The Vraxians worship Kalthor, a being of endless blades and eternal battle. The Xanthari pray to Uxima, a goddess who drinks the blood of warriors. My own people once honored Crystallis the Shatterer, who broke worlds for the glory of combat. Other species nodded or made gestures of agreement. War gods were common. Every civilization went through violent phases, and most created deities to represent and control that violence. Humans have warrior gods, yes. We have found references to hundreds of them in your histories. But we noticed something strange. None of them survived into your modern era. You have gods of love, gods of the sea, gods of wisdom, all still remembered and studied. But your gods of war are silent, forgotten, treated as primitive myths. Why? The chamber fell completely silent. Every being present turned its attention to the human delegation. Some species had dozens of eyes, all focused on Daniel. Others had sensory organs humans couldn't even name. All of them were watching, waiting. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. He and Karen had discussed this possibility during their preparation. They had hoped the question wouldn't come up. The truth was complicated, disturbing, and deeply personal to humanity. But the Galactic Council had strict rules about honesty. Direct questions required truthful answers. He looked at Karen. She was pale but nodded firmly. They had agreed that if asked directly, they would tell the truth. "All of it because we killed him," Daniel said. His voice was quiet but clear in the massive chamber. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The Vraxian delegation, massive warriors covered in battle scars, roared in confusion. The Xanthari began hissing and clicking in their own language. The energy beings flickered wildly. Even the normally calm Crithians seemed disturbed, their crystalline forms dimming and brightening rapidly. The Crithian ambassador raised one crystalline limb, and silence gradually returned. "Explain this statement, Captain Wright. You are claiming that humans murdered their own deity?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Yes, Ambassador. Approximately 12,000 years ago, when humans were still confined to Earth and just beginning to form complex civilizations, his name was Ares, and unlike your gods, he was real, physical. He walked among us." A Xanthari delegate, her scales a deep purple that indicated confusion, spoke up. "Your god was corporeal, not a spiritual entity or dimensional being?" Karen stepped forward to answer. "That's correct. We don't fully understand what Ares was, even now. Our best scientists have theories ranging from an evolved human with extraordinary abilities to an alien visitor to something else entirely. What we know for certain is that he existed in physical form. He could be seen, touched, and eventually killed." She activated the holographic display built into the podium. Images flickered to life above the council floor. large enough for everyone to see clearly. Ancient cave paintings appeared first, showing a massive figure surrounded by smaller human forms. Then pottery fragments carefully reconstructed depicting battle scenes with a giant warrior at their center. These are the earliest references we have to Ares, Karen explained, dating back nearly 12,000 years. He appeared during what we call the Bronze Age, a time when human civilizations were young and warfare was constant. The holograms shifted, showing stone tablets covered in ancient script, then metal reliefs from temples long since turned to dust. Each image showed the same figure, always massive, always associated with battle and blood. Ares was 3 meters tall, Daniel continued. He wore bronze armor that seemed to generate its own heat. His eyes glowed like molten metal. Where he walked, the ground itself trembled. He was stronger than any human, faster and seemingly ageless. And he fed on war, Karen added, not metaphorically. Actual conflict sustained him, made him stronger and more powerful. The more humans fought, the more violent their battles, the greater his power grew. The hologram now showed a battlefield, bodies scattered across blood-soaked ground. In the center stood Ares, arms raised, seeming to draw energy from the carnage around him. For thousands of years he encouraged human warfare, Daniel said. He appeared to kings and generals, whispering strategies in their ears. He manifested on battlefields, inspiring warriors to greater violence. He made combat seem glorious, death seem honorable. Under his influence, human civilization was locked in endless conflict. A Vraxian warrior, its voice like grinding stone, asked, "This does not explain the murder. War is natural. Conflict drives evolution, creates strength, pushes civilizations to improve. Why would you destroy a being that served this purpose?" Daniel and Karen exchanged glances. This was where the story became difficult, where they had to explain something that even humans struggled to understand. "Because," Daniel said slowly, "he changed, and we couldn't forgive him for it." The chamber erupted again in confused noise. The Crithian ambassador called for silence and gestured for Daniel to continue. It happened during a war between 2 Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta. A group of young soldiers from both sides found themselves trapped together, wounded and dying. Ares came to them, expecting to feed on one final battle. Instead, something happened that changed everything. Those soldiers, they refused to fight. And Ares, for the first time in his long existence, showed them mercy. The word hung in the air like a curse. A god of war showed mercy, the Crithian ambassador said slowly. "And humanity killed him for this?" "Yes," Daniel replied simply. "We killed him for learning compassion, and we've regretted it every day since." Karen stepped closer to the holographic display, her fingers moving across the control panel. The images shifted and changed, showing a progression of human history that few species outside Earth had ever seen in such detail. The council chamber remained silent, every being focused on the story unfolding before them. "To understand what happened, you need to understand what Ares was to us," Karen began. Her voice was steady, professional, but Daniel could hear the emotion underneath. She had spent years studying this period of human history, and it had affected her deeply. Ares wasn't like other gods in human mythology. Most of our deities existed in stories, in faith, in the hearts of believers. But Ares was different. He was there, real, tangible. The hologram showed ancient Mesopotamia, one of humanity's first civilizations. Crude buildings made of mud brick, people farming along riverbanks, simple tools and simple lives. Then the image shifted to show armies forming, men with bronze weapons and leather armor. The first recorded appearance of Ares was in Sumer, around 3000 BCE, Karen continued. A city-state called Uruk was at war with a neighboring settlement over water rights. The battle was small by later standards, maybe a few hundred men on each side. But it was vicious, personal. Men who had traded goods together were now trying to kill each other. The hologram showed the battle in motion, reconstructed from ancient texts and archaeological evidence. Warriors clashed with spears and axes, blood staining the desert sand. And then the image showed something else, a figure appearing at the edge of the battlefield, massive and terrible. Ares manifested during the height of the fighting, Karen said. Witnesses described him as appearing from nowhere, as if he had been invisible and simply chose to be seen. He was enormous, towering over normal men. His armor wasn't like anything humans could forge at the time. It was bronze, yes, but it seemed alive somehow, shifting and flowing like liquid metal while remaining solid. The reconstruction showed Ares in detail. His face was handsome but cruel, with eyes that burned like coals. His arms were thick with muscle, his hands large enough to crush a human skull. He carried weapons, a massive sword and spear, both crackling with energy that ancient humans couldn't explain. He didn't fight in that first battle, Daniel interjected. He just watched, observed. And as men died around him, he seemed to grow larger, more solid, more real. The survivors reported that they felt compelled to keep fighting, even when they were exhausted and wounded. They felt his presence like a drug, making them angry and fearless and violent. The Zenthari delegate leaned forward, her scales now a curious orange color. He fed on their conflict. We understand this concept. There are energy beings in the galaxy that consume emotions, but they are not physical as you describe. Ares was different, Karen agreed. He was both physical and something else. After that first appearance, he became more active. He would visit battlefields across the ancient world, always appearing where conflict was fiercest. Sometimes he would just watch and grow stronger. Other times he would participate directly. The hologram shifted again, showing different scenes from different eras. Ares standing among Egyptian soldiers as they fought invaders from the north. Ares walking through a burning Babylonian city. Fires reflecting off his armor. Ares on a beach watching ships clash in a naval battle. He developed patterns, Karen explained, preferences. He favored battles where the stakes were personal, where hatred ran deep. He loved civil wars, brother against brother, because the emotion was stronger, and he learned to cultivate these conflicts. He would appear to leaders in their dreams, plant ideas of conquest and revenge. He became sophisticated in his manipulation. A Crithian council member, younger than the ambassador, asked a question. Did your people worship him willingly, or did he force this worship? Daniel considered the question carefully. Both, in a way. Early humans didn't understand what Ares was. They saw a being of immense power who appeared during wars and made their warriors stronger and braver. Of course they worshipped him. They built temples, made sacrifices, prayed for his favor, and Ares encouraged this. The worship gave him another kind of sustenance, we think. Not just the violence itself, but the reverence for violence. The hologram now showed a massive temple, columns reaching toward the sky, priests in ceremonial armor performing rituals, young men trained in combat techniques, preparing to serve Ares through warfare. By the time of ancient Greece, around 500 BCE, the worship of Ares had become systematic, Karen continued. Every major city-state had temples dedicated to him. Warriors would pray before battle, asking for his blessing. Generals would sacrifice animals, sometimes even prisoners, hoping to gain his attention and favor. And he responded, Daniel added. Ares would appear to armies that honored him most. He would fight alongside them, and with his power they were nearly unstoppable. Imagine facing an army that has an actual god fighting in its ranks, a being who cannot be killed by normal weapons, who makes his followers fearless, who seems to know your strategies before you implement them. The hologram showed a battle between Greek city-states. One side had Ares fighting with them, his massive form cutting through enemy lines like they were children. The other side broke and ran, unable to withstand the psychological impact of facing a god in combat. But there was a cost, Karen said quietly. The more humans worshipped Ares, the more warfare became central to our civilizations. It wasn't enough to fight for resources or territory anymore. We fought for glory, for honor, for the approval of a god who fed on our violence. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war. The images shifted to show the darker consequences. Cities burned to the ground, populations enslaved, fields salted so nothing would grow. Endless cycles of revenge and retaliation, each side claiming Ares favored them, each side trying to outdo the other in devotion through violence. Humanity was trapped, Daniel said. We had created a feedback loop. The more we worshipped war, the stronger Ares became. The stronger Ares became, the more he influenced us toward conflict. Our civilizations were stagnating. Art, philosophy, science all took a backseat to military might. We were becoming a species defined entirely by our capacity for violence. A Vraxian warrior stood, its massive form impressive even in the diverse council chamber. You speak of this as tragedy, but we see progression. Conflict refines a species, removes weakness, creates strength. Your god was guiding you toward power. Karen turned to face the Vraxian directly. That's what many humans believe too. And if Ares had remained constant, maybe we would have continued down that path. Maybe we would have become a warrior species, spreading through the stars on rivers of blood. But something changed. Something unexpected. The hologram shifted once more, showing a small valley between mountains. The sky was dark with storm clouds, and rain fell heavily on the rocky ground. Bodies lay scattered across the valley floor, a mixture of soldiers from different armies, their blood mingling in the mud. "This is where it happened," Karen said softly. "A minor battle in a forgotten war between Athens and Sparta. Nothing that should have mattered in the grand scope of history. But it changed everything." Daniel took over the narrative. A patrol from Athens encountered a similar group from Sparta. They fought, as they had been trained to do, as their god demanded. But the battle went wrong. Both groups were driven into this valley by the fighting, cut off from their main forces. They were young men, barely trained, and they were dying. The hologram showed figures huddled in the rain, clutching wounds, crying out for help that wouldn't come. Some were Athenian, some Spartan, but in their suffering the differences seemed meaningless. There were about 20 of them total, Karen continued. Maybe 12 from Athens, 8 from Sparta. All wounded, all dying slowly in that cold rain. And then Ares appeared. The massive figure materialized in the hologram, standing at the entrance to the valley. His armor gleamed even in the dim light, his eyes burned bright. He had come to feed, to encourage one last fight before these young men died. He commanded them to fight, Daniel said. Told them they could die as warriors, honored by their god, or die as cowards in the mud. He promised that whoever won would be blessed, would survive their wounds, would return home as heroes. The holographic soldiers looked at Ares, then at each other, and something happened that had never occurred before in all of Ares's long existence. They refused. The holographic display showed the valley in exquisite detail, reconstructed from ancient texts and oral histories that had been passed down through countless generations. Rain fell in sheets, creating rivers of mud mixed with blood. The wounded soldiers lay scattered across the rocky ground, some propped against boulders, others flat on their backs staring at the stormy sky. Ares stood at the valley entrance, massive and imposing. His burning eyes swept across the scene, taking in the dying men with what should have been satisfaction. This was his purpose, his sustenance. Young warriors bleeding out, their hatred for each other still fresh, their final moments perfect for one last burst of violence. He needed only to push them, to remind them of their training and their duty. "Fight," Ares commanded. His voice was like thunder, rolling through the valley and echoing off the stone walls. "Take up your weapons. Die as warriors, not animals cowering in the mud." The hologram focused on one young man, an Athenian named Lucas. He was 19 years old, barely old enough to grow a proper beard. A Spartan spear had pierced his side, and he knew the wound was fatal. He had hours at best, maybe less. His hand rested on his sword, and he could feel the pull of Ares's command, the divine compulsion to obey his god. Lucas looked across the valley at the Spartan soldiers. One of them, a young man named Peter who couldn't have been more than 18, met his eyes. Peter had a terrible wound across his chest, and his face was pale from blood loss. They had probably fought each other earlier, might have even caused each other's wounds. They were enemies by birth, by training, by the demands of their cities. "No," Lucas whispered. The word was so quiet that it should have been lost in the rain. But in that moment it was the loudest sound in the valley. Ares's eyes flared brighter. "What did you say?" Lucas spoke louder, his voice shaking but clear. "I said no. I'm done. I'm done killing my brothers." Another soldier, this one from Sparta named Christopher, started laughing. It was a bitter, broken sound. "Brothers? We're Spartans and Athenians. We've been enemies since before our grandfathers were born." "Are we?" Lucas asked. He tried to sit up, gasped at the pain, but managed to prop himself on one elbow. "Look at us. We're all Greek. We all pray to the same gods. We all bleed the same red blood. And we're all dying in this forgotten valley for a war none of us truly understand." Peter, the young Spartan, reached out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but in that context it was revolutionary. Lucas stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then reached across the space between them and clasped it. Their blood mingled, Athenian and Spartan, enemy and enemy. And yet in that moment, just two dying boys who were tired of fighting. Ares roared. The sound was primal, filled with rage and confusion. The earth beneath them trembled. Rocks tumbled down the valley walls. "You dare refuse me? I am your god. I am war itself. You exist to fight, to kill, to die in glorious combat. More hands reached out. Soldiers who had been trying to kill each other hours before now helped each other sit up, shared water from their flasks, tried to comfort each other's pain. The line between Athenian and Spartan blurred and then disappeared entirely. They were just men, young and scared and dying, and they chose in that moment to die in peace rather than give their god what he demanded. You gave us this war, Christopher said, his voice weak but defiant. You and the men who worship you. You made us believe that killing each other was glorious, that dying young was honorable. But I've seen enough death today. I've caused enough death. If these are my last hours, I'll spend them as a human being, not as a weapon. Karen paused the hologram, freezing the scene at this crucial moment. She turned to address the council, her eyes bright with emotion. This had never happened before in all of Ari's existence. For thousands of years he had commanded and humans had obeyed. Violence was his nature, war was his essence, and humanity had always given him what he needed. But these young men, dying and afraid, found the courage to refuse. Daniel continued the story. The ancient texts describe what happened next in different ways, but all agree on the essential facts. Ares stood there in the rain, staring at these soldiers who had defied him. His rage was terrible to behold. Lightning struck the valley walls. The ground cracked. He could have killed them all instantly, snuffed out their lives with a thought. But he didn't. The hologram resumed, showing Ares slowly walking into the valley. His burning eyes swept across the scene, taking in every detail. The way Lucas and Peter still held hands across the divide that had separated them. The way an Athenian soldier was using his cloak to cover a shivering Spartan. The way they had arranged themselves in a circle, protecting each other from the wind and rain. They say that Ares stood there for an hour. Karen said softly, just watching them. The soldiers expected him to strike them down, but he didn't. He seemed confused, like he was seeing something he couldn't understand. These were warriors, trained from childhood to fight and kill. They should have been incapable of refusing him. Yet here they were, choosing peace in their final moments. The hologram showed Ares kneeling among the soldiers. His massive form dwarfed them, but his posture was different now. The aggression was gone, replaced by something that might have been curiosity or perhaps wonder. Why? Ares asked. His voice was quieter now, almost human. Why do you refuse? Death in battle is glorious. You could die as heroes, honored by your cities and remembered forever. Lucas coughed, blood flecking his lips. I don't want glory anymore. I just want this to mean something. And dying to feed a god's hunger for violence doesn't mean anything at all. Another soldier, an Athenian named Gregory, spoke up. We were friends once, you know. Before the war, Peter and I grew up in the same region. Our families traded together. Then Athens and Sparta went to war again, and suddenly we were enemies. We've been trying to kill each other for 2 years. For what? For land? For pride? For you? Peter squeezed Lucas's hand tighter. I'm tired of hating. It takes too much energy, and I don't have much left. If I'm going to die here, I want to die remembering what it was like before the war. When we were just people, not soldiers. The hologram showed a change in Ares' expression. The burning eyes flickered, dimmed slightly. His face, usually set in lines of rage and battle lust, seemed uncertain. Karen zoomed in on his features, showing the council every detail of this transformation. This is the moment everything changed, Daniel said. Ares was experiencing something he had never felt before. Thousands of years of existence, thousands of wars, millions of deaths, and he had never questioned his purpose. Violence was what he was, what he did, what he needed. But these young men were showing him something different. They were showing him that there could be another choice. The ancient texts that Karen had studied described what happened next in elaborate detail. Ares had reached out with one massive hand, placing it gently on Lucas's wound. The soldiers had flinched, expecting pain or death. Instead, warmth spread through Lucas's body. The pain faded. The torn flesh began to knit back together. Within moments, the fatal wound was gone, leaving only a scar. The hologram showed the soldiers staring in shock as Ares moved among them, healing each one in turn. Peter's chest wound closed. Christopher's broken leg straightened and mended. Gregory's punctured lung sealed itself. One by one, the god of war used his divine power not to harm but to heal. Impossible, the Varaxian warrior said, his voice filled with disbelief. A god of war cannot heal. It violates the fundamental nature of what they are. War is destruction, not creation. That's what everyone believed, Karen replied. That's what Ares himself probably believed. But in that moment, faced with these young men who chose peace over glory, he changed. Or perhaps he discovered something that had always been inside him, but had never been allowed to emerge. The hologram showed Ares standing as the soldiers slowly got to their feet, testing their healed bodies with wonder and disbelief. They surrounded him, these young men from enemy cities, and they weren't afraid anymore. They were grateful, amazed, transformed by an act of mercy from a god who was supposed to know only violence. "Thank you," Lucas said simply, and the others echoed him. Ares looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I have never done this before. In all my ages of existence, I have only ever taken life, never given it. This feeling, this power used to heal rather than harm. It's different. It's better." The last line hung in the air, and Daniel let it resonate through the council chamber before continuing. Those words doomed him. A god of war who believes that mercy is better than violence is useless to a civilization built on conflict. Word of what happened in that valley spread quickly. The priests heard. The generals heard. The kings heard, and they were terrified. Karen changed the holographic display to show the interior of a temple. The building was magnificent, with marble columns and bronze decorations lit by hundreds of oil lamps. But the men gathered inside looked anything but peaceful. They were priests of Ares, dressed in their ceremonial armor, and their faces showed fear and anger in equal measure. This meeting happened 3 days after the incident in the valley, Karen explained. The high priests had gathered from temples all across Greece. They came from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, every major city-state. Some of these men were enemies in the political sense, their cities at war with each other, but they all served Ares, and news of what he had done united them in concern. The holographic figures began to speak, their words reconstructed from historical records. An elderly priest from Athens named Marcus stood at the center of the gathering. "We have all heard the reports. Our God appeared to dying soldiers and healed them. He used his divine power to give life instead of taking it. This cannot be allowed to continue." Another priest, Jonathan from Sparta, nodded vigorously. "The soldiers he healed are spreading word of this mercy. They're telling everyone who will listen that Ares has changed, that he no longer demands blood and battle. Do you understand what this means? If people believe that war itself has become peaceful, they will question everything we've built." A younger priest named Kevin looked confused. "But isn't this good? If Ares has learned compassion, learned to value life, perhaps we should celebrate this change. Perhaps we've been wrong to glorify violence all these years." Marcus turned on Kevin with fury in his eyes. "Wrong. Everything we are, everything we have, comes from our service to the god of war. Our temples, our influence, our power over kings and generals, all of it depends on humanity's need for violence. If Ares stops encouraging warfare, we become obsolete." The hologram showed other figures entering the temple. These were military commanders, generals who had built their careers on conquest and battle. A Spartan general named Richard spoke first. "The priest sent for us and we came. We hear that our God has gone soft, that he healed soldiers instead of inspiring them to glorious death. This is unacceptable." "More than unacceptable," added an Athenian commander called Andrew. "It's dangerous. My soldiers need to believe that dying in battle is the highest honor. They need to think that Ares watches over them and values their sacrifice. If they start believing that even the god of war thinks peace is better, how can I send them to fight and die?" Daniel took over the narration. These men understood something fundamental. Their entire world was built on warfare. The economy ran on conquest and plunder. Political power came from military might. Social status depended on warrior achievement. If Ares stopped supporting the system, everything would collapse. The holographic meeting continued. A priest named Brandon stood and addressed the gathering. "There is only one solution. Ares has become corrupted. He has forgotten his true nature. For the good of all humanity, for the preservation of civilization as we know it, the god of war must be destroyed." Silence fell over the temple. The gathered priests and generals stared at Brandon with a mixture of shock and fascination. The idea was blasphemous, impossible, and yet in that moment necessary. "How do we kill a god?" Kevin asked, his voice barely a whisper. Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We are not the first to ask this question. Ancient knowledge exists hidden in the deepest temple archives. Methods to bind and destroy divine beings. They were created long ago, in case a god ever turned against humanity. We never thought we would need them against Ares, but the circumstances have changed. The hologram shifted to show deeper chambers beneath the temple, secret rooms where ancient artifacts were stored. Weapons glowed with inner light, chains hummed with power, scrolls covered in writing that predated human civilization itself. The priests and generals descended into these depths seeking tools to commit deicide. They gathered everything they could find. Karen continued. Arrows blessed by Apollo, the god of the sun, that never missed their target. Chains forged by Hephaestus, the smith god, that could bind anything including divine beings. A spear touched by Athena, goddess of wisdom, that could pierce any defense. Even items from other pantheons traded or stolen over the centuries, each one capable of harming immortal flesh. The hologram showed weeks passing. More conspirators joined the plot. Kings who feared losing their power, merchants who profited from war, even common soldiers who had built their identities around being warriors and couldn't imagine a world where violence wasn't glorified. The conspiracy grew like a cancer, spreading through Greek civilization. They planned it carefully, Daniel said. They couldn't just attack Ares in the open. Even weakened by his newfound mercy, he was still a god, still immensely powerful. They needed to lure him somewhere controlled, somewhere they could use their weapons effectively, so they sent him an invitation. The holographic scene shifted to show a massive amphitheater carved into the side of a mountain. Thousands of soldiers stood in perfect formation, creating a circle around a throne at the center. The throne was made of bronze and decorated with symbols of war and victory. Everything looked like a celebration, a festival to honor the god of war. They told Ares it was a gathering in his honor, Karen explained. A great festival where all of Greece would come together to celebrate his glory. After thousands of years of worship, it seemed natural. Ares accepted the invitation without suspicion. The hologram showed Ares arriving at the amphitheater. He walked down the mountain path, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, his presence making the very air shimmer with power. The assembled soldiers cheered as he approached, their voices echoing off the stone walls. To Ares, it must have seemed like the old days, before his moment of mercy, when humans worshipped him without question. He sat on the throne at the center of the amphitheater, looking out at the thousands of warriors gathered to honor him. He raised one hand in acknowledgement of their cheers, and that's when the trap was sprung. The first arrow struck him in the shoulder, Apollo's blessed projectile piercing his armor as if it were paper. Ares roared in pain and shock, trying to stand, but chains erupted from the ground beneath the throne, wrapping around his legs and arms. Hephaestus's bindings, unbreakable and inescapable, held him in place. They came at him from all sides, Daniel narrated, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was describing. Thousands of soldiers, each armed with weapons blessed by various gods. They attacked their own deity, the being they had worshipped for generations. The battle lasted 3 days. The hologram showed the brutal assault in detail. Soldiers swarmed the throne, striking with swords and spears. Ares fought back despite the chains, his divine power killing dozens with each movement. But there were always more. For every soldier that fell, 2 more took their place. Blood soaked the amphitheater floor, most of it human but some of it divine. Ares could have destroyed them all, Karen said quietly. Even bound, even wounded, he had the power to kill every single human there. But something had changed inside him. That moment of mercy in the valley had opened something new, some capacity for doubt and restraint that had never existed before. He couldn't fully commit to the slaughter, even as they murdered him. The hologram showed Ares weakening, his movements slowing, his burning eyes dimming. Athena's spear pierced his chest. More arrows found gaps in his armor. The chains tightened, crushing his divine flesh. Through it all, the soldiers kept coming, kept attacking, driven by fear and desperation and the commands of their leaders. On the 3rd day, Ares finally spoke. His voice was weak, barely audible over the sounds of battle. I understand now. You kill me not because I was cruel, but because I learned to be kind. Not because I harmed you, but because I chose to heal. You cannot forgive mercy from a god of war. Marcus stood at the edge of the battle, watching. You became useless to us. War is what we need, what our civilization requires. A god who questions violence is worse than no god at all. Ares laughed and blood bubbled from his lips. Then I am glad to die. Better to perish for showing mercy than to live forever as a monster. Remember this moment, humans. Remember what you're killing and why. The final blow came from an unlikely source. Lucas, the young Athenian soldier who Ares had healed in the valley, pushed through the crowd of warriors. In his hands he carried a simple bronze sword, nothing special or blessed, just a normal weapon. Tears streamed down his face as he approached the dying god. "I'm sorry," Lucas whispered. "I'm so sorry." Ares looked at him and managed to smile. "Don't be. You showed me something beautiful in that valley. You showed me that humans can choose peace even when everyone demands war. That choice changed me and I don't regret it. Strike true, boy. End this." Lucas drove the sword into Ares' heart and the god of war died. The holographic display faded slowly, leaving the council chamber in dim light before the normal illumination returned. Karen stood quietly at the human podium, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. They had just shared humanity's darkest secret with the galaxy, and the weight of that revelation pressed down on them both. The Crithian ambassador was the first to break the silence. Its crystalline form had dimmed significantly, a sign of deep contemplation among its species. "The god died. What happened then?" Daniel took a deep breath before answering. "Everything changed. When Ares died, his body dissolved into light and scattered on the wind. The soldiers who had killed him stood in that amphitheater, covered in blood, surrounded by thousands of their dead comrades. And slowly they began to understand what they had done." Karen reactivated the display showing the aftermath. The amphitheater was a scene of devastation. Bodies lay everywhere, the price of 3 days of divine combat. The soldiers who survived looked shell-shocked, their weapons falling from numb fingers. Some were crying. Others just stood and stared at the empty throne where their god had died. Lucas, the young man who struck the final blow, collapsed next to the throne. Karen continued. The other soldiers from the valley, the ones Ares had healed, gathered around him. They were all weeping. They had experienced the god's mercy firsthand, and now they had participated in his murder. The guilt was overwhelming. The hologram showed the days that followed. Word of Ares' death spread across Greece, then to other civilizations. The reaction was complex and contradictory. Some celebrated, believing that humanity had freed itself from a tyrant. Others mourned, understanding that they had destroyed something precious. But everyone felt the absence. The god of war was gone, and suddenly warfare felt different. Battles continued, of course, Daniel explained. Human nature didn't change overnight. But something fundamental had shifted. Before, when men fought and died, they could tell themselves it was glorious, that Ares watched and approved. Now when they looked at the blood on their hands, they just saw blood. The divine justification was gone. A Zenthari delegate, her scales now a deep purple indicating sadness, spoke up. "You said this happened 12,000 years ago. Surely the impact would have faded over time. Why does it still affect your species so deeply?" Karen smiled sadly. "Because we made sure it wouldn't fade. In every human culture, in every corner of Earth, we told the story of Ares. We taught our children what we had done. We turned it into myth, legend, history, whatever form it needed to take to be remembered. We made sure that every generation would know that humanity once had a god of war who learned mercy, and we killed him for it." The hologram showed different civilizations across time. Egyptian priests teaching children about the foreign god who died for showing kindness. Chinese philosophers writing about the Western deity, who was murdered for choosing healing over harm. Native American storytellers adapting the tale to their own traditions. The story mutated and changed as it spread, but the core remained the same. "It became humanity's original sin," Daniel said. "Not the violence we committed, but the mercy we punished. That guilt drove us to be better. Every time we developed a new form of warfare, we also developed new philosophies of peace. Every military innovation was matched by a diplomatic one. We became obsessed with finding alternatives to violence." The hologram showed human history accelerating forward. The development of international laws, the creation of courts to resolve disputes peacefully, the founding of organizations dedicated to preventing war, all of it driven by the memory of what humanity had done 12,000 years ago. "We invented the concept of war crimes," Karen added. "The idea that even in battle, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. We created rules for warfare, ways to limit suffering even when conflict was unavoidable. Other species thought we were weak or foolish. Why would warriors limit themselves? But we understood. We were trying to honor the mercy that Ares showed in his final days." The Vraxian warrior who had spoken earlier stood again. His voice was different now, thoughtful rather than challenging. "You let guilt transform your entire civilization. Most species would have forgotten or rationalized such an act. But humans made it central to your identity. We had no choice, Daniel replied. The guilt was too powerful to ignore. Every time we went to war, we remembered Ares. Every time we sought peace, we remembered what he tried to teach us. He became more influential in death than he ever was in life. The hologram showed human expansion into space. The first colonies on the Moon and Mars. The development of faster-than-light travel. The moment humans detected the first alien signal and realized they weren't alone in the universe, and through all of it, the story of Ares traveled with them. When we finally reached the stars and encountered other species, we had a choice to make. Karen explained. We could become conquerors using our military technology to dominate. We had the capability. Human weapons development never slowed down, even as we pursued peace. But every time someone suggested using force, someone else would bring up the story. Remember Ares, they would say. Remember what we did to the god who chose mercy. Daniel activated a new section of the display, showing diplomatic missions, peace treaties, joint scientific ventures with alien species. We chose to be ambassadors instead of invaders. We offered technology and friendship instead of threats. When other species asked why humans were so eager to avoid conflict, we told them the truth. We're not peaceful because we're weak. We're peaceful because we're ashamed. The Crithian ambassador rose, a gesture of respect that caused a ripple of movement through the chamber. I begin to understand. You carry the memory of your murdered god as both burden and guide. Every act of diplomacy is an apology. Every peace treaty is atonement. Yes, Daniel said simply. We can never bring Ares back. We can never undo what we did. But we can honor what he became in his final days. We can choose mercy when violence would be easier. We can show compassion when anger would be more satisfying. We can be the people he briefly believed we could be. A new voice spoke up. One of the energy beings that existed as pure thought and light. Its words came through as pure concept, translated by the chamber's systems into language everyone could understand. Other species have gods of war who inspire them to glory in battle. But humanity has transformed their murdered god into something more powerful. You have made guilt and remorse into tools for progress. Karen nodded. Every human child learns about Ares before they learn to read. We tell them about the valley where he showed mercy. We tell them about his murder. We tell them that humanity's greatest shame was punishing kindness, and we ask them to be better than their ancestors. The hologram showed classrooms across human space. Children of all ethnicities and backgrounds listening to the story, their young faces serious and contemplative, teachers explaining the moral weight of what their species had done. The lesson was always the same. Mercy is harder than violence, and that's exactly why it matters. We're not perfect, Daniel admitted. Humans still fight. We still struggle with violence and hatred. We haven't transcended our nature. But we try every day to be worthy of the mercy Ares showed us. We try to be the species he believed we could be in those final moments. The Zenthari delegate spoke again. You asked to join the Galactic Council. You wanted to be part of our community of peaceful species. Now I understand why. You're not running from your violent past. You're running toward a peaceful future driven by guilt over a god you killed 12,000 years ago. Running toward redemption, Karen corrected gently. Every day that humanity chooses peace over war, every conflict we resolve through words instead of weapons, every time we show mercy when we could show strength, we're proving that Ares' final belief in us was justified. We're proving that his death meant something. The Crithian ambassador moved to the center of the chamber, a position of authority. I have lived for many thousands of your years. I have seen species rise and fall, watched civilizations evolve and collapse. Never have I encountered a people so fundamentally shaped by guilt and remorse. Other species remember their gods with pride. Humans remember theirs with shame, and that shame has made you better than you would have been with pride. Other delegates began to rise one by one. The Vraxian warriors, known for their love of combat, stood and bowed their heads in respect. The Zenthari, whose culture valued strength above all, dimmed their scales in acknowledgement. Even the energy beings, ancient and powerful, pulsed with what might have been approval. The Galactic Council accepts humanity, the Crithian ambassador declared, not in spite of your violent history, but because of how you've let that history change you. You don't have a god of war to inspire you to battle. Instead, you have the ghost of a murdered god reminding you every day that mercy is worth dying for, and that kindness is worth killing for. Daniel felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Karen was crying too, her hand finding his and squeezing tight. They had told the story, shared the shame, and somehow it had been enough. "We'll remember," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll always remember Ares. We'll remember the soldiers in the valley who refused to fight. We'll